So we're going to start 5.2. So we're looking at the areas of youth health and well-being that need action. So what are the different areas or the different kind of concerns that we have with young people and their health and well-being, and which kind of areas do we need to basically act or intervene or try to make some change towards when it comes to youth health and well-being. So before we go into the different issues that affect young people and the factors or the reasons as to why young people experience these issues, we have to look at this term called health inequalities. So health inequalities basically means that whenever you take 2 young people or 3 young people or 4 young people, the health of those people will never be the same. Even if they might be growing up in the same community or they might be around the same age, their health will still be quite different. Okay, it's never going to be equal, and that's what we mean by health inequalities. Health inequalities can actually come up as a result of different reasons or factors. So for example, Tim might be from a higher income compared to Natalie. Or, Joseph might have a better level of education compared to Miriam. Okay, so all of those things can actually affect, all of these factors can actually result in one young person's health being different from another young person's health. We know that certain young people like to take more risk-taking behaviors, whereas certain young people try to play it safe and be a little bit more cautious. Okay, so all of these things can result in health inequalities. Now, whenever we're talking about health inequalities arising from socio-cultural factors, for example, young people's health is different because of income or education, okay, or employment level or employment status. Those are what we call as social inequalities, okay? So it's important for us to distinguish, because social inequalities are actually a really important and really impacting kind of inequality for young people. So young people may also experience inequalities because a lot of the time when young people make decisions, they tend to use their heart rather than their head. So they tend to focus more on their emotions rather than reasoning or rather than logic or rather than common sense. And so a lot of the time they don't think about, okay, what are the risks or what are the consequences of me doing this thing? And a lot of people, young people are like, you know what, I'm still young. There's no chance that I could die. There's no chance that I could be paralyzed or disabled for life from doing this, So a lot of the time young people think they are invincible. And that, again, can lead to some young people having worse health compared to other young people. Okay, so that's what health inequalities are about. And all the factors that we're going to look at today and tomorrow are kind of focusing on the different behaviors, on the different factors, on the different kind of actions that different young people can take that might lead to them getting kind of different levels of health. So one person might smoke, which might make their health bad, whereas another young person might choose not to smoke, which makes their health a little bit better. Okay, so that's basically the gist of what we're looking at in 5.2. So if we move on to the next slide, the first thing that we're looking at that can differentiate the health or the health status of one young person compared to another is injury. Okay, so injury, we know, is another word for morbidity, but injury can also cause mortality as well. Okay, so if you're in a really intense car crash, you can actually die from that, okay? And a lot of the time you might see that whenever there's a car accident, people put flowers at the kind of side of the car crash, okay? Because a lot of the time, car accidents can be quite intense and the chances of someone surviving a car crash is quite low. When we look at non-fatal injuries though, so injuries that cause more morbidity, we're looking at things like sporting injuries, okay? Someone spraining their foot, someone spraining their ankle, breaking their arm or breaking some bones, okay? Those are not going to lead to death, but they are going to lead to some kind of serious injury or serious morbidity, okay? However, almost all injuries are considered to be preventable. Think about it, a lot of car crashes happen because a person hasn't been paying attention to the road, or they haven't been paying attention to, the hazards in their environment, or they've been drinking and driving, or they've been using drugs. Okay, even the other person that might have caused the car crash who wasn't paying attention, they could have prevented that car accident from happening. So it's not always the driver's fault. That's what we're trying to say here, okay? When you're playing a sporting injury, you could have warmed up a little bit better. You could have, been a little bit more cautious, okay? Almost all injuries are not inevitable. And for that reason, we say that they can be prevented. And the government puts a lot of funding into making sure that there are injury prevention programs in place to make sure that people don't get injured, because this is one thing that we can actually control to some extent. Now, if we're looking at, okay, what does injury actually cause? What kind of consequences for health? The serious consequences of injury, so this is talking about like pretty intense after effects of injuries are spinal cord damage, and we know that can lead to paralysis or people getting paralyzed. Traumatic brain injury, which can result to things like memory loss, it can result to things like amnesia, it can result to things like not being able to function normally, and even death. Okay, so death in the case of like serious car crashes or serious head injury that leads to like the brain bleeding out and then not being able to function from that. Less serious consequences are those that result in morbidity. So we're talking about soft tissue sprains, we're talking about brain fractures, cuts, wounds, getting a dislocated shoulder, all that kind of stuff. These are more commonly seen in sport, like we said before. Now, yeah, one of the reasons why young people are more likely to get injuries, number one, a lot of young people do play sports. And a lot of young people start driving around maybe 16, 17, 18 years of age. And when they start driving, they really feel like they've got all this freedom and that they can try new things and that they can be a little bit risky. You know, they can drive a little bit fast in an area where they think there's no police or whatever. Okay, so all of that, those kinds of factors can lead to young people getting more injuries because of sports or because of car accidents compared to the other stages of the lifespan, okay? One of the main reasons that they brought in green P plates was that they wanted there to be another level before a young person could actually get their full license. Because, you know, back in the old days, it was like red Ps and then you're onto your full license. But the government did research and found that a lot of the time, that's not enough experience for a young person to actually be able to drive safely without getting into a like car accident or car crash. So obviously, the government kind of keeps a close eye on young people and their levels of injury. So, okay, what are some of the reasons now or contributing factors? So whenever the slide says contributing factors, it means what are the factors or what are the reasons or what are the things that contribute to young people getting injury or young people, you know, for that specific type of issue that we're looking at. So in this case, it's injury. Number one, we know young people play more sports, okay? Young people will always play more sports than an 80 or 90 or 100-year-old. It's just common sense. Secondly, young people's brains are still developing. So those of you who do psychology, you might remember that we learned about the frontal lobe being the last lobe of the brain to mature in young people. And that the frontal lobe has everything to do with decision-making, self-control, you know, impulsivity and spontaneous behavior. So obviously, because young people's brains and their frontal lobes haven't still fully developed to maturity, they're more likely to increase behavior like risk-taking behavior, drinking and driving, you know, doing stunts that might lead to them getting injured and all that kind of stuff. Increased independence. So a lot of the time, especially as you leave school or especially as you get to your later years of your teenage years, you start to get more independence. You can start to go out to places without your parents having to obviously accompany you. And that sometimes gives young people a little bit more freedom to maybe engage in risk-taking behavior that they might not be able to do with an adult around. Okay, developing new skills. So we've already talked about how driving can actually be a really scary thing because a lot of young people can actually do things that not only impact their own lives, but impact the lives of everyone else on the road. Okay. Finally, not really relevant to you guys as much, but generally a lot of young people in Australia are introduced to alcohol when they're like 15, 14, 16, like within that age. And so a lot of them might not know how to control their alcohol consumption. And we know that alcohol is an intoxicant. It can lead you to do things where you're not in control of your body, you're not in control of your behaviors or what you say or what you do. So alcohol can also lead to a lot of issues, especially if you drink and then decide to go driving. Okay, that's like the worst combination there. We also remember when we looked at employment and the role of your job in terms of affecting your health and well-being, we learned about the fact that your workplace environment can actually have risks as well. So if you work in Coles or something and you're bending down to get like a heavy pallet of, I don't know, boxes or food products or whatever, you might actually hurt your back in the way that you do that if they haven't taught you how to properly pick up something heavy. Also, for example, remember we watched those WorkSafe ads in class where the guy's trying to pick up the boiling vat of oil and he's kind of like unbalanced and he kind of tips it on himself. So all of those things can actually lead to a young person also getting injured, okay? And remember, a lot of young people do start working around 15 or 16 years of age. So this is a really kind of hotspot in terms of an age where people are getting injured, okay, especially young people. So this is just a bit of data taken from your textbook, just looking at the different kinds of kind of causes of injury in males and females aged between 15 to 24 years. So if you just have a quick look at this graph, just a few things that stand out. So intentional self-harm, we can see is much higher or significantly higher in females compared to males. Okay, and if we're going to explain that, well, when we learn about mental health in the next chapter, you're going to realize that females actually have higher rates of depression and higher rates of certain mental disorders compared to males. Okay, let's look at something else now. Transport accidents. Okay, transport accidents relates to like getting into car accidents and things. So you realize here that men or males are actually the ones who have a significantly higher rate of injury because of getting into car accidents or motorbike accidents, okay? Any kind of transport accident where transport is involved. So what could be a reason for that? Well, maybe it's because males tend to socialize more around, their love for transport or their love for cars or their love for bikes. And so maybe in terms of peer pressure, maybe when you're in a group of males, you might be more likely to be pressured to maybe to maybe drive after you've had a few beers or something. Okay, so it's just about contemplating what are the different kinds of reasons as to why males might have significantly higher rates of injury from a certain reason compared to females or vice versa. Let's look at another one. So if we look at assault or, getting into physical attacks or physical kind of injury from, physical assault, males are quite moderately higher than females in this instance. And what could be a reason for that? Well, biologically, males have testosterone, and testosterone is a hormone that makes them more physically aggressive, okay? So if something really riles them up, they're more likely to punch someone, whereas, maybe females are more likely to argue about it, okay? So again, it's important for you to...
Miss,
Yes?
Ella said that her laptop shut down. Just so you know.
That's okay. I will... Oh, the work's already mentioned on the class page, so she should be able to just check out what to do. That's okay. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so obviously it's important for us to be able to look at not only the data, but be able to understand, okay, why is the data looking like that? Why is it that males, for example, are getting more injury as a result of being exposed to mechanical forces? Okay, maybe it's because more males work in kind of fields like construction and building, where they are exposed to a lot more mechanical forces or machinery. Okay, so it's really important for you to be able to not just look at the data, but also to be able to justify why it is the way it is. Okay, so any questions so far on injury before we move on to the next factor? No? All good? Okay, cool. So the next factor that we're looking at, or the next kind of youth health issue that is kind of like quite prevalent in Australia, is alcohol use. So obviously...
That's kind of sexist, why all males just work in the mechanical force.
Well, it's not sexist. It's what the research says. I mean, we're not saying all females can work in the mechanical force if they want to, but if you take numbers of males employed in that field, then you'll find that, yeah, there are more males employed in that field, sadly. Yeah. Okay. So that's basically, yeah, you should be able to justify it. Of course, sometimes your justifications might come across as sexist, but it's just like, if you look at the data, that's what it's going to say. Okay, we're not saying females can't work in construction or building, but the research kind of shows that more males do. And that's kind of reflected in the data here as well. Okay, so if we move on to the next one, which is alcohol use. So obviously, even though we know in Australia you cannot buy alcohol without a proper ID, because they're not going to sell alcohol to people who are under 18 years old, obviously. People do have access to alcohol before they turn 18, okay? Sorry, someone asked a question just now? Okay. So obviously one of the reasons for this is they might ask their older brothers, older sisters, cousins, anyone that's older than them to buy it for them. Someone say something? Okay. So obviously alcohol is very accessible, even though the government says, yep, we won't be selling alcohol to anyone under the age of 18. It is actually easy to get alcohol for a lot of young people in Australia. It's not difficult, okay? Some families are really kind of base a lot of their socialization around alcohol consumption. And they might even be like, here you go, you can have a beer, you can have a bottle, that's fine, it's not a big deal. So even in terms of a family, if there's a lot of like the mum and the dad in the family drink alcohol, the child is also more likely to drink alcohol as well, because the parents have made it look like it's acceptable and that it's fine and it's just a social thing. Okay. Problem is that when youth have alcohol, especially at their young age, when they're still developing and when they're still going to school and they're still playing sports, it can have a lot of issues. Okay. So number one, young people who drink alcohol tend to have reduced alertness and concentration. So they struggle a lot in school, especially, you guys know what hangovers are, like people drink too much alcohol the night before and then they come back to school or they go to university the next day. They can't focus. Okay. They're just completely, their mind is just a complete blur. They have reduced coordination skills. So a lot of the time, top athletes or top people who are like top sports people, they actually have they're on a strict diet where it's not only what they eat, but they can't even drink alcohol, because alcohol can actually reduce your coordination skills. Reduce problem solving ability. So it can reduce your ability to think critically and to solve problems. Increase risk taking behaviors. People who drink alcohol are more likely to try to pull a stunt. Okay. They're more likely to get injured trying to, jump off a table or something. They're more likely to get injured trying to go behind the wheel after having a few beers. Okay, all of that stuff is because alcohol is an intoxicant and it can actually reduce people's inhibitions. What we mean by inhibitions is people have less kind of control over what they think they can and cannot do. Increased mental health issues. So although a lot of people turn to alcohol to deal with things like depression and stress and anxiety, alcohol actually can also lead to increased mental health issues, okay? Because obviously, like other addictive substances, alcohol only gives you a little bit of a high for just a few minutes or maybe an hour, and then after that you kind of crash, okay? Increased aggression. So obviously people who drink alcohol are more likely to be aggressive because, like I said before, alcohol does reduce your inhibitions or your ability to control your behavior. Lowered ability to identify risks and related to risk-taking behavior, lower levels of self-control. So a lot of the time people who drink alcohol, you might have seen in movies and TV shows, they're not able to control what they say. They're not able to control what they do. And a lot of the time they end up saying things or doing things or behaving in a way that they later regret the next morning. And the last thing, which is a really big issue, especially with young people, is that young people haven't grown up from the age of 5 or 6 drinking alcohol. It's something that's new to them when they're in their teenage years. And for a lot of them, they don't know when to stop. And when they don't know when to stop, this is what we call as binge drinking. It's when you just keep drinking, and you're consuming extremely high levels of alcohol in a very small time frame. So within 30 minutes, you've already downed 8 or 9 beers, for example. Okay, it's a really high concentration of alcohol that's getting into their system. So now let's look at the contributing factors to alcohol use. So number one, young people are more likely to attend parties. They're more likely to attend new social environments where alcohol is likely to be served. Okay, you've seen this in every American TV show when they go to a party and it's just there's alcohol everywhere. And it's where did it come from? It's just, it's just the basic social norm. Being in a family environment where alcohol is allowed, for example, like I said before, a lot of mums and dads of certain young people in Australia might drink alcohol with their dinner. They might have a glass of wine or something. And so it becomes normalized to the young person that, okay, drinking alcohol, it's not a big deal. It's just like me cracking open a can of Coke, okay? It's not a big deal. Many young people also drink due to social reasons, so that helps them to fit in, to be accepted. And obviously this issue of peer pressure also comes in. Also, when we're talking about Australian culture, we know that Australian culture is obviously promotes alcohol consumption, okay? A lot of social outings, if you go to a footy game or if you ever see Australians having barbecue, you'll notice that they do tend to have a lot of alcohol along with that. Also, celebrities tend to drink a lot, and drinking alcohol can be glorified a lot in TV shows and films. So like we learned when we talked about the effect of celebrity endorsements, for example, this can also influence young people to drink because it looks like it's a socially desirable thing to do. So if my favorite singer is drinking, why can't I? And some people, not all Australians, but some Australians, especially Australians that kind of live in the countryside, they tend to kind of associate drinking with values like mateship, the fact that you're self-reliant, you're independent, and you're a hardy person. Hardiness means that you're a really sturdy, strong kind of person because you drink. okay? And people who don't drink or who might say, no, thanks, I don't feel like drinking today, might be seen as being a little bit of a wimp or being a little bit of a scaredy cat for not being able to drink, okay? Or not being man enough, for example, okay? A lot of ideas of masculinity in rural Australia are focused around this idea of drinking, which is another reason why they have higher rates of alcohol consumption compared to people who live in city kind of areas, okay? And again, this is related to the fact as well that young people in countryside or rural areas tend to have lower educational levels as well, okay? The next thing that we're talking about is illicit use of drugs. So when we're talking about illicit use of drugs, we're basically talking about the fact that young people are, you know, consuming, or they are taking part in consuming drugs which are obviously illegal in nature. Okay, so we're not talking about like Panadol, we're not talking about like Nurofen, we're talking about like intense or hard drugs, things like marijuana, things like amphetamines. Okay, amphetamines are things like ecstasy, MDMA. Cocaine, heroin, all these drugs are kind of illegal, and a lot of young people do actually consume them, okay? Now, misuse of illicit drugs can have an even more intense impact on a person compared to alcohol consumption. So number one, what can happen is that you can get internal organ damage. So you can have like liver damage. Number two, we can have like poor academic performance, okay? Because some drugs actually kind of stunt or depress your cognitive abilities. Unemployment, because obviously if you're taking drugs and if they sense that you've taken drugs, your workplace will obviously fire you, okay? They won't want to keep you in employment. Increased criminal behavior. So people who take drugs sometimes have certain episodes. They might become in the sense that they actually start to engage in more criminal behavior. So they might rob a store when that wasn't actually something they might normally do without drugs. Okay, and because drugs have such an impact on those around you, it can lead to family breakdown as well. Now, young people who experiment with substances during youth are more likely to develop substance abuse issues later in life. So it's similar to that concept of obesity that we were talking about last time, that young people who are overweight or obese are likely to carry the habits that made them overweight and obese into adulthood, okay? So young people who take drugs in youth are also more likely to carry those habits into adulthood as well, unless they get like going to rehab or have some kind of like professional intervention in there. Okay. Also, because of peer pressure or because of the family environment that you're in, young people can also become victims of other people's harmful drug taking behaviors. And you see this a lot in domestic violence cases where a father or a mother might be domestically violent towards a child, not just because they're a bad person, but because they take illicit drugs, and these drugs turn them into people that are very different from the non-drug version of that person, okay? So that's basically another reason why illicit use of drugs can affect young people's health and well-being. Okay, so then we look at contributing factors. So obviously, number one, young people are likely to take risk-taking behaviors, and illicit drug use kind of falls into that category of risk-taking behaviors, of trying something new, feeling curious to try out what it is. Sometimes youth are also peer pressured in the same way that youth are peer pressured to drink or smoke. Some youth are also peer pressured into taking illicit drugs, particularly if they're going to a lot of parties, clubs, or festivals. Youth also use drugs to fit in, so again, connected to that idea of peer pressure. Some youth take drugs because they think that those drugs will improve their mood or make them feel happier, and we see a lot of this being supported by, you know, movies and TV, where a person takes a drug and suddenly they're in some kind of happy land where they're feeling good and they're feeling happy. However, obviously this is not the case. And some people will also take drugs just out of curiosity to see what it's like, to try out a new experience. We're going to look at some data relating to this as well now. So if we look at the data on this page here, you'll notice that it says, when you look at the 14 to 19 year age group, the most prevalent or the most strongest factor that influenced why a young person would take a drug and why they would continue to then take that drug for the rest of their life or for some time was curiosity, to see what it was like, or out of curiosity. 72.2% of young people tend to take drugs for the first time in their teenage years because they want to see what it's like. They're curious to try it out, okay? And you'll see that these percentages kind of change in terms of age. So between 14 to 19 to 20 to 29, in some cases, for example, if we look at this, thought it would improve mood or to stop feeling unhappy. A lot of young people watch too much TV and they think drugs will make them feel you know, better. Okay, but by the time you're the age of 20 to 29, a lot of young people are kind of more educated, and they realize that taking drugs is probably not going to make me feel better. It's probably not going to have that much of a difference. Okay, so you can see how kind of mindsets and attitudes towards illicit drug use change from 14 to 19 versus 20 to 29. Okay, so that's just a little bit of data they've taken from your book. Okay, the last thing we're going through today is smoking. So we've done a lot of stuff about smoking this year, but again, this is something that's going to repeat itself next year as well. So I'm not going to go through it in too much depth, but just going to highlight the important things. So smoking is a pretty big youth issue, probably more so than illicit drugs. And the reason for that is that illicit drugs are not always super accessible, okay? You have to really get into touch with some kind of, I don't know, dealer or some kind of person who sells them. That's not easy, and a lot of young people know that illicit drug use is like, whoa, it's one step too far for a lot of young people. Smoking, though, is seen as quite acceptable. A lot of young people's parents or older brothers, older sisters, cousins, aunties, uncles might smoke. So it's kind of, in the same way as alcohol usage, is kind of seen as a normal thing. But the research shows that if you can get through your youth or your younger years of your life without smoking, you are going to be less likely to smoke later. You're not likely to then take up smoking when you're an adult, okay? Smoking is one of those things that really develops as a habit in your younger years. If you look at someone who's 56 or 60 years old and you ask them, okay, when did you start smoking? They're very likely to say, okay, I started smoking in my 20s, or I started smoking when I was 16, or I started smoking as soon as I could buy a smoke, okay? So smoking is something that develops in youth, and it gets worse as you get older. Obviously, it's important to realize that smoking is bad because smoking increases the chances of mortality or premature death. A young person who started smoking and continues that into adulthood would nowhere near live as long as someone who never smoked. You're also likely to get smoking-specific diseases, so things like lung cancer, things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is another lung kind of condition, cardiovascular disease because it affects your heart and it leads to the buildup of all these fatty plaques in your arteries and vessels, and respiratory conditions like asthma and other related conditions. Now, when we look at the contributing factors of smoking, we're looking at basically number one, even though we've got so much information around about how dangerous smoking is, all these campaigns from Quitline and all the government and everything, young people still continue to smoke. One of the reasons for that is obviously peer pressure. Another reason for that is that young people, again, think that they're invincible. They think, okay, well, if my aunt smokes, she's really old, so she'll probably die from it. But, you know, I'm still young, so I probably won't die from it if I just try it a few times a week. It's not a big deal. So young people underestimate the effect that smoking can actually have on them. Also, obviously, young people are influenced by those around them. So if they see family members or they see close friends who are smoking, they might be more likely to smoke as well. Okay, especially because young people are very impressionable and can be easily influenced. Tobacco advertising is not as big these days. You don't just see advertising on YouTube or on TV about, you know, smoking and cigarette, because the government's actually banned all of that. But sometimes in TV shows and movies, you still see people smoking, like it's not a big deal, okay? Especially if you watch a show that's kind of set in the 80s or set in the 90s, you still see a lot of people kind of smoking to let off some steam, or when they get stressed, you see them pulling out a cigarette. Okay, so it's still kind of portrayed as a cool thing to do in some TV shows, or something that makes a character stand out or look like they're an edgy kind of person. So yeah, that's basically the contributing factors to smoking. So that brings us to the end of today's presentation. So what do I need to do today? So what you need to do today is, we've already done the first thing, and I'm going to explain this again now because some of you might not know. When you go into the class page, you should have a tile that says Term 2, Week 3 right at the top. Whenever you're confused about what you have to do, you need to click onto that tile and you'll get a whole page of what you need to do in each online session. So today's online session is almost done, and I never expected you guys to do much work today. All I want you to do now in the remaining 8 minutes or so is to watch this really short clip. So go into the class page and watch this really short clip, which is talking about alcohol and drugs. And it's basically giving some young people's experiences about their exposure to alcohol and drugs. So that's all you have to do today, because you've already tuned into the Zoom recording. I just want you to watch that YouTube clip, which I've linked on the class page. And you can find this clip if you click into the Term 2, Week 3 tile. Okay, so I'm just going to stop the recording.